When I grew up in Bundelkhand and grew up in a village, we had commons, we had forest, and we had these panchayat lands, etc. But never, I didn't hear that, as commons. It's like, okay, this is panchayat land, or this is forest department's land.
More recent context, right? There's no too much of focus on biodiversity in protected areas, right? But there's a lot of literature saying there's a lot of biodiversity outside protected areas. Suddenly, commons become relevant again if you're working on biodiversity conservation.
When you're talking about commons and climate change, there is the non-human, there is the whole biodiversity, ecology side that you brought out, the issue of development which both of you have brought out. And very front and center of that is the idea of the community. Commons and community are actually very deeply interlinked.
So the third model is the commons model, and which is so relevant today.
Climate change and commons come across as two very distinct categories, really big categories. But are they actually interlinked? For instance, how does climate change really impact commons landscapes, the people who depend on commons, the livelihoods that are dependent on commons, whether it's land, water, and all those other physical forms? At the same time, how does that connection of people and commons, can that actually be part of a solution to address the climate crisis? And in order to understand that interlinkage, for us, important to understand that climate change, once framed in the way of only carbon emissions, actually disconnects itself from commons. If we actually make the framing of climate change embedded in the idea of collective action, commons, and all the kinds of knowledges that are associated with commons, maybe there are some solutions that may emerge and those intersections will be clearer. Hello, I'm Kanchi Kohli, researcher and educator. In this episode, we dive deeper into the questions that interlink climate change and commons. And to do that, we have two great speakers with us today. Kumar Sambhav, founder of Land Conflict Watch, Siddharth Krishnan, senior faculty at A3. Thank you for being here.
No, thanks for having me, Kanchi.
My pleasure, Kanchi, and this is my first podcast.
Wow.
So, I'm kind of nervous.
No need to be. I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation and chat like friends. So it's I'm looking forward to it. And just to start off, I think just to learn from the two of you, when did you first come across the word commons, and what was your reaction? Did you feel it's relevant to you, or did you feel it was like completely alien? Just your thoughts and reactions.
For my PhD at the Madras University, I worked on forest conflicts, kind of working on an agenda that Ram Guha set, right? He worked on the Chipko, but he called for social scientists to kind of work on forest conflicts and land conflicts in smaller scales, and I worked on the Nilgiri Wayanad. So I didn't really kind of engage with commons in my literature. But I joined A3 on a postdoc in 2005. And it was then that I first started hearing the word commons, right? Because there's a lot of emphasis on institutions and how local institutions are important for natural resource use and conservation. And there was a lot of reference to political science literature, especially Ostrov's literature, right? So that was when I first heard of commons. But over the years, as commons has become broader, right? Not confined and close to, that parcel of land, to become some kind of a politics, a state of mind, right? So now common kind of is swamped by commons in a good sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So you did embrace it, right?
Yes. So, you cannot not embrace it.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. That's true. Yeah.
I heard about it when I started working as an environment journalist. I was given my editor. I was given the beat of forest reporting. And in the context of forest commons, I would also hear about non-forest commons. But forest was straightforward to understand, right? There's so much politics around obviously attachment to forest because of greenery, conservation, wildlife, and then diversion of forest for mining, etc. So as a reporter, initially I thought, okay, the forest commons are sexier. Non-forest commons are like slightly probably not so much sexy as a reporter to report on. What would you even report on it? Like, seems very simple.
Wastelands.
Not many people are talking about it. So that was my understanding. So I did initially I was like, okay, this is not something I need to engage too much with. Just early young reporter to see what gets more traction. Later, I realized that, the more, forest obviously has more defined layers of intersection, conflict, politics around it. But something which is not defined also, non-forested commons, would have even more deeper layers of intersections and, with people. And that, as I started working in the field, became more and more interested in understanding that how when things are not defined, which are very broad, how it takes to another layer of conflicts, or even vague definitions, what do they cause in terms of practice. So it became even more and more interesting for me.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating. And so both of you actually came across the word commons through your work then. Okay.
Yeah. No, but also, in a more recent context, right? There's too much of focus on biodiversity in protected areas, right? But there's a lot of literature saying there's a lot of biodiversity outside protected areas.
What protected areas you mean?
National parks and wildlife sanctuaries, right? And then suddenly commons become relevant again if you're working on biodiversity conservation.
Yeah. Anyways, it is interesting you pointed out that, we heard only in work. I grew up in Bundelkhand and grew up in a village. We had commons, we had forest, and we had these panchayat lands, etc. But I didn't hear that, as commons. It's like, okay, this is panchayat land or this is forest department's land. So it's interesting that, in many of our practices, I think, especially in the time when I was growing up, you don't really hear about commons as commons, even if you're part of that settings in many.
So now when you go back home, do you actually look at a piece of land and say, oh, that's commons?
Yeah, I do. And then I look at from the tragedy of commons angle that, okay, how do nobody recognizes, acknowledges.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I'll start with you, Siddharth. It's like you've done as an environmental sociologist so much work at landscape level changes. So one is, of course, areas which may be very contained. When there are landscape level changes that take place, how does that, of course, commons is very much part of that landscape level change. Part of what that landscape has been is commons. How would you actually relate those landscape level changes to climate crisis, climate emergency, etc.? Does it both ecologically as well as socially, does it increase vulnerability? How do you actually link, the idea of that landscape, or whether it's resilience or risk of that landscape to climate change?
The key word here, Kanchi, is landscape, right? Now, for various reasons, political and analytical, and also environmental and spatial reasons, we kind of we enclosed this commons as a space, as a nice space, where it is managed by community, right, for economic sustenance, etc. But it's a very, if I can use the word, a patchy way of looking at things, right? Now, there is this subdiscipline in ecology called landscape ecology. It's a fantastically interdisciplinary field, right? So, if you look at, now I come from the Nilgiris, right? The Nilgiris, as you know, was India's first biosphere reserve. Right? So biosphere reserve has its own zoning categories, core, buffer, transition zones, right? And more recently, and I think we can talk about it as we have this conversation, is the Gadgil Committee's demarcation of ecologically sensitive areas, right? Spatial work, and they kind of broadly overlap. But landscape ecology talks about mosaic. It talks about patches and patterns of patches and corridors, right? And so it is very important to kind of locate commons in a larger landscape, right? Because commons themselves are not just so-called wastelands, right? Then now it turns out that they're not really wastelands. They were in retrospect a land bank for late capitalism because they're using it. For example, in Chennai and these commons near cities are a lot more vulnerable. I'll come to that. But what we need to do, they're not wastelands because commons, and we're talking about 65 million hectares in India, right? And that is I don't know which European country, right? It's a huge swath of land, right? And we're talking about ecosystem services generated by these common lands. It could be flood regulation, it could be pollination, it could be carbon sequestration, right? At the same time, so there are biophysical and socio-economic continuities between other parts of the landscape and common lands also, right? And so if there is degradation or denudation in other landscape patches, they have implications for common lands also. And common lands also support those in very complex ways, right? So which is why,
it would work the reverse as well.
Reverse as well, absolutely, right? So, I started off working on forests in the Nilgiri Wayanad, the ecological history, environmental history about, I worked on, and I think, Kumar, you kind of know about this place, right? It's, Gudalur. India's longest land conflict is happening there, right? But it's a more forest-based approach. I was looking at the environmental history of that whole, zamindari abolition and what happened. But as I've grown older, as I've taught and done more research, I don't believe in, my whole research was patchwork. That forest, that grassland, right? But now I'm zooming out, I'm looking at landscape level, and it's making a lot more sense to me. It's very, very important. Because otherwise, you tend to kind of, think about, commons in isolation, whether it's a pastoral common, whether it's a forest common or a river. And if you isolate it like that, it's not good analytically or politically.
So just to build on that a little bit, any breakages in that seemingly cohesive sort of landscape, how would it then actually would it exacerbate an environmental problem, a climate, in what ways would that breakage of that landscape have a link with link with climate change or a climate impact or something like that?
But let me come to climate change, right? Now, before that, we have the other crisis, linked crisis of biodiversity loss, right? I think our species is responsible for the 6th mass extinction or whatever, right?
Would you mean wildlife, is it? Or what? But when you say biodiversity,
plant and wildlife.
So how would you describe biodiversity in that?
Biodiversity, both habitat, species, genetic, whatever, right? The scientists say we are the 6th mass
plants, animals,
all of that.
Okay.
All of that. But the solution for that, the spatial solution for that was protected areas. Now, protected areas, national parks, just like enclosures, they have a very interesting environmental history. They were traditional responses to the onslaught of modernity in US and also in UK. In US, for example, when white settlers were decimating old Indian lands, native Indian lands, right? And a lot of white sages and gurus, they were kind of aghast, and they kind of propagated and politically fought for these spaces like the national parks, right? I think the first national park in America, the world, was Yosemite, I think, Yosemite, right? Now, that was kind of a traditional solution to modernity's onslaught, right? And now that model has become a cultural import to India, right? As a modern import. So India, right, which is the most developed modern way to kind of conserve our resources, it's through national parks, which has actually had its very interesting origins in as
very Western.
It's a traditional response to modernity's onslaught. Now, if you look at enclosures, they are a very feudal aristocratic measure, right? But they came as a modern land management measure to India, including creation of the forest department, right? So these protected areas, national parks or wildlife sanctuaries or even reserve forests, the lands with the forest department, they get valued for biodiversity. But other spaces, it's as if they're not valuable biologically at all, right? So which is why, and we know, today we have a lot of large mammal movement, elephants, tigers and leopards and bears across landscapes. They survive on these landscapes. But there's a lot of conflict, but there's also talk about coexistence, etc. in India, right? So, in terms of biodiversity conservation, I think this is very, very important to have, to respect and have that landscape level kind of orientation in terms of continuities.
It's interesting. I think when trying to draw the linkages between commons and climate change, you've actually brought in two very essential conversations. One is about biodiversity. That you cannot, when you're talking about commons and climate change, there is a non-human,
Absolutely.
which we need to take into account. And the other aspect that you very clearly put on the table is the way how we treat places.
Absolutely.
What are commons being actually used for, valued for, overridden in some senses.
Absolutely.
So the development, quote unquote developmental question. So I think both these are link. If you have to see commons and climate change together, it has to be seen with these as well.
Yeah.
I think,
and also commons are becoming vulnerable under climate change, not because of weather events.
Yeah.
It's because, for example, if you look at the usual common lands in India, which are grazing spaces, they're being afforested in the name of compensatory afforestation and sequestration. Right now, that changes the character of those grasslands, and that makes pastoralists very vulnerable, a lot more vulnerable.
Correct. A lot of these things that Siddharth has spoken about, Sambhav, I think is so much got to do with what you see happening right in front of you. As a journalist and a reporter, you've been in the spaces where the climate policy discourse or the negotiations about what should be the solutions to climate change is really discussed. So it's like, we are talking about what's changes that are happening to commons on the ground, but a lot of the discussions are really far removed from where the commons are really. Or rather those commons are, creating a certain narrative.
Yeah.
So over a period of time, you've followed the discourse, you've reported on it, you've also researched on it. How have you seen the climate discourse evolve? And at what point of time did you see questions of commons, or maybe not literally, but questions of land, indigenous people, culture, really come into, which may have been discussed in global forums, but may not have been front and center to the climate discourse, which was talking about carbon emissions or, GHG emissions and that kind of technocratic language. Yeah. How would you actually think of that trajectory?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. In fact, if you really take a step back and look at both, like what happens locally to commons and how the policies and of the governments are decided based on global discourse, there's a link. I mean, we could clearly see the link, and which is really not a good sort of outcome of what's happening to commons. So coming to, let's start from like high level at the global negotiations level. There is an excessive sort of focus and stress on mitigation measures for climate, which is basically cutting down on carbon emissions through projects like renewable energy installments, carbon capture, carbon sequestration, so plantations, afforestation projects, etc. There are 2-3 reasons for this. One, because I think everything in terms of negotiations and policies are dictated by the economic sort of models and prerogatives of the governments, rather than ecological or really the climate. So there is always this tension and conflict at these policy levels between mitigation and adaptation, right? So the powerful actors, including the global north, most of the pollution has been caused by the global north. Their focus right now is that everybody, including global south and developing countries, cut on emissions. So it's like, okay, you cut on coal mining, you cut on coal thermal power, and you install more and more renewable, you do more and more afforestation. And also there is a obsession with the measurable targets of how much carbon you are cutting, etc. But as I said, and I think in the beginning we talked about, commons are very much sort of grounded in the adaptation.
What would you mean by adaptation?
That would basically mean that, if in the existing scenario, the climate change is happening and I have to be more resilient, or communities have to be more resilient. So cutting down of emissions comes later. But what do we do right now when the climate crisis is coming to us? How do we become more resilient to it before mitigating? So that's the adaptation space. And that is mostly sort of crucial for the most vulnerable communities. That how do you adopt from the local systems? That's where the importance of commons really comes up. But it's not so much quantifiable. Like, how Siddharth was explaining. It's a very sort of complex ecosystems and landscapes where they interact with each other. So you can't quantify that, how adaptation success can be measured for communities. So it doesn't produce those quantifiable results at the policy level. So this is one reason why it is ignored. If you look at the global climate finance flow also, 90% of the finance goes for mitigation measures. And again, that's imposed on the global south that, okay, you do not develop at that space, you cut on your climate, on your emissions, etc. Unfortunately, those measures and those climate actions which are sort of rooted in the mitigation force, they are causing more damage to the commons and the adaptation space. So, for example, if I tell you about the renewable energy spaces, now they need large chunks of land, they need barren lands, and they are now coming on these common spaces, which are considered wasteland in the policy and the governance sort of space. So on revenue records, most of our commons, which are not forests, are wasteland, quote unquote. Unproductive land. And this is a colonial sort of hangover because they were not producing any revenue to the administration at that point. So these are wasteland. But they have so much ecological value. But even more than that, they are also really the source of livelihood dependence for the most vulnerable communities. So if you go to a village, there would be caste and class difference where landowners are a certain caste or a certain class of people, and then there is huge amount of this huge population which is maybe marginal farmers or landless farmers or people who are dependent or living on these commons. They've culturally sort of been dependent on that, but their rights are not recognized on these on these spaces. So when projects like, say, large renewable energy projects or even plantation or reforestation projects come up, these lands are assigned to these projects without sort of recognizing these dependence of communities or their rights or cultural practices on these commons. So they further sort of marginalize them. Exclusion happens. Now, unfortunately, like Siddharth said, the climate crisis has been a result of extractive industries capitalism, which excluded these communities, displaced communities. Now, the solution which is being projected to this crisis is also doing the same thing. They're excluding people. They are displacing further people. So they've been sort of faced the brunt of the climate crisis. Now the climate solution is also exclusionary, which is facing on. So yeah, so I think at the but so this discourse doesn't really play up in the policy space. We have seen in the negotiations that of late there's been discourse on indigenous rights. So there has been some sort of acknowledgement that forest-dependent communities, forest needs to protect it, their rights needs to be protected.
Is it only forest or land-based communities, or does it even talk about
commons? Does not talk about. So the recognition of, say, generally for commons outside forest or much broader definition of terms of commons, that is not sort of acknowledged, recognized. So the value of that in the climate space of adaptation space is really not recognized or talked about. Yeah.
It's interesting. So before I come back to you, Siddharth, I think just because, and some of you brought out the whole interlinkage. Both of you have actually brought out the interlinkage between renewable energy and commons. Yeah. And I think recently Land Conflict Watch has come up with a report called Hidden Cost of Green Growth. Yeah. Where I think one of the points that you all have really emphasized on is this exactly the point that you were talking about, the renewable energy futures of a country like India are so much dependent on the availability of those common lands. It'll be great if you could just share a little more about that research, what prompted that research. How did you actually go about doing it? Any particular places of that you would want to highlight from, the kinds of case studies that you have in that report? It would be great to learn about.
Yeah. So, what prompted that research is, so at Land Conflict Watch, we document all kind of land conflicts where communities are involved, across sectors, across spaces, across geographies. And then we, this data as we have been collecting from the grounds as and when new conflicts emerge, we saw that many conflicts were also sort of coming up around renewable energy projects. And renewable energy projects, mostly the utility scale projects, large solar and wind, they require immense amount of land. The land it's like, say, for a large renewable energy project, the amount of land is required is probably bigger than many of the other industrial projects. So it's a...
But those would be what? Grazing lands, or what would it be? Like usually...
They mostly are grazing lands or grazing pasture land. And that's what we are seeing in states like Rajasthan, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu. And it's different from, say, other extractive industries, say coal mining or other mining, which happens mostly in forests, because that's mineral rich states. Here, for renewables, you need barren lands. So it'll be mostly barren lands. Yeah. So there would be grazing lands and other pastures. Now they're even looking at water bodies, so floating solar and all. Those lands are, as I said, are assigned without recognizing or acknowledging the values that they have hold for communities and even biodiversity value. So these, many of these are grasslands also, which is very rich in biodiversity. But those aspects are not recognized and assigned to the renewable energy projects. And when we actually did an analysis of 31 utility scale renewable projects that are facing some kind of conflict on the ground, very interesting thing that came out is that 80% of those projects, the conflicts are around common, wholly or partially. Now, there have been a lot of discourse that, okay, how renewable energy should be made responsible, how renewable should be more accountable, because it's a good thing. I mean, it is we need renewable. We need to have energy transition as well as a response to climate crisis. But how do you make it more inclusive, responsible? In that discourse also, we realize that the importance of commons, or that the commons are at the center of conflict, hasn't been coming out at the policy discourse or practitioner discourse. And this data was very important to show that you need to recognize this, this aspect. Even if the law or the policy does not recognize formally the rights of people over these commons, communities are very sort of aware of that their rights exist on these commons. So many of these projects would either end up in protests on the ground or in court disputes. So communities have gone to the court and said that these our rights are disrespected, and the projects get stalled. So while we all need more renewable, this pace of transition is being sort of affected and slowed down because of these conflicts. And if we don't recognize the value of commons, this is not really going to work after a point, or not scaling up after a point. So we have seen that 23 gigawatt of renewable capacity is affected by conflicts.
So when you say conflicts, it's a broad term, right? So if you have to visualize that conflict, is it in the way of, you didn't ask me, you didn't compensate me, you didn't make me a shareholder, my access is, what is that? How, if I have to really feel that conflict, what would it be? Or all of the above?
It's all of the above. It's literally all of the above. So in fact, in the data, we have been documenting what is the main contention that the communities have. So I think one of the biggest contention has been that the communities want access to common, retain access to common. Second, formally recognizing their rights and livelihood over commons. Third has been, say, procedural violations, so that they are not consulted. In most of these projects, communities are not consulted. And I think I'll point out a very important policy gap in how these projects are being implemented, is that renewables, because they are considered green and good, for public, they're exempted from environment impact assessment or social impact assessment. Now, that's really doesn't make sense, because the amount of the kind of footprint they have, environmental footprint and the land footprint, it's huge. And the biodiversity impact, environmental impact is going to be huge. Same for communities, social impact is going to be huge. Now, there are discourse and there are critique of the existing EIA process and SIA process, that it doesn't really work, etc. But despite it's not working to its ideal situation, the minimum thing that it ensures is that there are consultation with the communities, and there is transparency in public domain about what is happening with this project, when is this project coming, how much money is involved, what is the scale. None of that happens in the cases of renewable energy projects, because there is no requirement of this EIA or consultation or SIA process. So I think the biggest contention that the communities have, that the conflicts are rising, that you never talk to us. You never considered our sort of impact or our contentions or demand. How do we become a stakeholder, even in terms of, even not like formally, like informally, are our concerns addressed or not? So that has been the case with that, and that's happening even other climate solution projects like plantations. So plantations, you did bring it out that, you need land for plantations as well, for afforestation, for climate sequestration. Now it's considered green and good. So really not many procedures of what's its impacts on people, etc. are assessed. And what would happen is you plant a land, you do afforestation on a land and then enclose it for protection. Enclosure means that communities that had access to these lands or commons, they get excluded. They don't have access to that. Even many solutions that now people are talking about, agri batteries and, photovoltaic batteries, etc., where communities and developers work together for plantation, there is issues of trust. They're like, no, we can't work together. So I think that discourse has to come up that, how do you make those people part of these solutions? Then it would be more beneficial and sustainable.
So it's interesting. I think so. We when we are talking about commons and climate change, there is the non-human. There is the whole biodiversity, ecology side that you brought out, the issue of development, which both of you have brought out. And very front and center of that is the idea of the community. Commons and community are actually very deeply interlinked. So I think this story about how mitigation is really playing out with the commons is clear. And some of you also brought out the need for regulation, policy, etc. And if I have to come back to you, Siddharth, I think you wrote a very powerful article when on the Western Ghats and linking landslides in the Western Ghats to the climate crisis and argued for a science-based policy. It is the lack of that science-based policy that is really exacerbating this conflict. So, I mean, if you could just share a little more about where that, that power really came, or that power that was very troubled power really came out. And I think just, talk about it a little.
Yeah, it's, so I kind of wrote it for, I think, the Kodai Chronicles, and then Naresh agreed to kind of syndicate it for Scroll. And Rajni George, who was the editor for Kodai Chronicles, so she said, write about this policy, Gadgil, but make it personal, bring in your biography too. I said, I've never written anything like this. I'm a boring academic, right? So I struggled, it was a good struggle through that article. But that particular article, it kind of links to commons in three ways. One is knowledge as commons. The other concept which is linked to commons, which is collective action. Yeah. And I also kind of mentioned a kind of a small environmental justice story around commons belonging to a pastoral people called the Todas, right? I'll come to that. But to kind of start with knowledge as commons, right? So my whole lament in that story was every time there is a landslide in Maharashtra or in Wayanad or in the Nilgiris, in the Biosphere Reserve, right? Every time a river swells and overflows, right? Everyone's like, climate change is terrible, but we feel very sorry that Gadgil committee report was not implemented.
What was that Gadgil committee report?
So the Gadgil committee report, so it was a panel, the Western Ghats Ecology Expert Panel, which was sanctioned by J. Ram Ramesh in 2010 or 11, I think, in Kotagiri in the Nilgiris. And they kind of put up a team of headed by Madhav Gadgil, policymakers, ecologists, and GIS experts, etc., who went around kind of zoning the Western Ghats, into ecologically sensitive areas, and depending on how sensitive they were, using various parameters, biodiversity and ecosystem services, etc., they made it sensitive zone 1, sensitive zone 2, sensitive zone 3. So every time. When there's a crisis, a climate crisis in the Western Ghats, in Goa or Kerala or Karnataka or Kodagu or wherever, public is like, so what happened to the Gadgil report? We should have implemented it, right? And that's why I kind of ended that story saying the ghost of good work. That ghost keeps coming up. It's public money, it's taxpayers' money,
Yeah.
Right? 3 years, fantastic, 2 years, 3 years, fantastic work went into it. So many public consultations, so much of data, right? And then you just junk the report and five iterations of the report. Whose money is it? It's public, right? It's public knowledge. Of course, the report is public knowledge, but what happened to that money? So that, in that sense, knowledge is commons, as wasted commons. The other aspect is the idea which is linked to commons, which is collective action. So there is that small reflective, part in that essay where I talk about how I grew up when the Western Ghats movement was on, right? There was Claude Alvarez, Asar Hiramat, Pandurang Hekade, all the stalwarts. And my father was an environmental lawyer. He was also part of it. And that's why I came to know about it, Claude Alvarez. And I grew up with them. So collective action then means heating the street. You walked. You did the Padayatra. You protested.
Yeah.
See what happened in Nepal. Look what's happening in Madagascar. Today, unfortunately, collective action is kind of being captured by technocracy. It's all about, the whole social sector now is about, I look at these posters for these workshops, collective action workshops. Earlier, they would have a fist or a woman with a sickle or something. Now it's all kind of a hipster with a phone, with coffee, doing, what do you call,
we need
metrics
that too.
and analysis and
Do we not
evaluation. Yes, right. So collective action, whether it's over commons or uncommon lands, whatever, it's gone from being a street protest to indoor, hipster action. And that was the other thing I was kind of uncomfortable about in that came. But the case study I mentioned in that particular piece was about the pastoral lands, the grasslands in the Upper Nilgiris belonging to the Toda community, right? So the Upper Nilgiris, if you have visited, it never had forests. It only had grasslands and small stunted evergreen forests called sholas. Now, what the British did was, and much of it was kind of graced by the Todas, and I come from the Badga community, and we kind of, we had this exchange system with the Todas, and they would give us land, and we would give them grain, millets, etc., right? It was a symbiotic system. But what the British came and did was, they kind of took over these Toda lands and kind of legislated about 2,300 acres of land for about 15 Toda clans. It's called the Toda Pata lands, right? So it's very interesting. It's an early kind of a precursor to the Forest Rights Act, because neither the government nor the Todas can alienate that land. It's with them, right? But of course, it was a massive shrinkage of land. But also, Todas had about access to 3,000 acres of grasslands to graze in. But what the British did was they kind of afforested these spaces with eucalyptus, wattle, and pine, right? And eucalyptus is known for being a thirsty kind of tree. A pine they planted to desiccate all the swamps. They thought swamps are like disease spaces, right? And these are actually wetlands, marshlands. And then wattle, it was grown like tea and coffee. It's a fantastically invasive species. It's taken over the Upper Nilgiris. You can't do anything about it. People are trying, scientists are trying, forest department is trying, nothing we able to do about it. Anyway, they're trying, right? So first, these grasslands get afforested. So grazing space is shrunk. And then you had dam projects. Start in the colonial period, complete in the post-colonial period, the Paikara Dam project and other dam projects. You inundate the afforested grasslands and the rear grasslands. And then there was this factory which belonged to, it was called Rallies India then. So they made capsules with gelatin kind of thing. And they were not treating the effluents. And for about 30 years, they were letting out. So you have the grasslands afforested, remaining grasslands are inundated by reservoirs, dam reservoirs, and those reservoirs are polluted. All these were commons, right? And the Todas had suffered from that for buffaloes died, people were becoming unhealthy, right? And they're a small population, 1,500, never crossed 1,500, 1,800 through history. And they've suffered. But we had an environmental justice project which was funded by the Azim Premji Foundation. And, I have to kind of thank my stars because we did that research. We collected the water samples and A-Tree's lab and analyzed it. And we found it to be very harmful to livestock and humans. At the same time, a very dynamic collector called Innocent Divya, that was her name. She used to be Jayalalitha's office. And after Jayalalitha passed away, she became the collector of the Nilgiris. And just the day when we had that workshop in Keystone to share the data from the project. And then she took over and the both Times of India and Hindu covered it, and she read the report, and she was very active. On the third or fourth day, she got the pollution control department to check the waters again, and she shut down the factory kind of thing. But the story here is that this was kind of pastoral land of the people, commons, you would say, right? The Badagas used it, the Kotas used it, etc. So the British afforested it, and the remaining grasslands they inundated with dam waters, commons, and then factories pollute that, right? So this is the tragedy. A local tragedy of the commons, if you call it, and right. So that story had that story also,
that element
also.
So I mean, if suppose for you, the two aspects of science and society, if they really have to come together, which are the stories that both of you are really talking about, specifics, where both science and society are being disrupted. And commons really requires, commons as collective action, etc., really requires both science and society to come together. Is the commons framing a useful framing to make that happen? So, for instance, what I'm saying is that if governments, if the private sector, if climate policy groups, etc., have to be explain the idea of commons. And the convergence of both science and society through commons. Would it be a useful framing to go to them with? And how would you make that abstract notion of science and society through commons come alive for say a climate policy person?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
No, absolutely, Kanchi. I mean, so you had commons as space. Right? Biophysical space. It could be a grassland, it could be a forest, it could be a river or whatever, right? Which people used and managed collectively. And the tragedy of commons came, right? Now, the real tragedy of commons is the origin story itself. So the guy who wrote it, Hardin, tragedy was, he was saying that community people are selfish. They won't take care of the commons, they'll overgraze it, blah, 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 right? And so the state and private interests are the best way to manage commons. Now then came political, we're talking about science and society, but we're talking about social science. The political science come in, and Eleanor Ostrom, the Nobel laureate, she comes and she says, no. There is a lot of empirical evidence for communities all around the world, right? Whether it's Europe or South America, or Africa, India, wherever, right? Where people have collectively managed these commons, right? So she came up with a third alternative for governance, which is people. Community who can manage commons, right? Now suddenly that's a third element of governance, an alternative disruptor to two models which have fantastically failed. The state model has failed. Capitalism private model has failed. So the third model is the commons model, and which is so relevant today, not just as biophysical space, but political space, ideological space.
Well, how do you explain something like this, which may appear as a little abstract? And this is a question I'll pose to the two of you, because you're in the field, you're trying to, make this happen, etc., alongside all the research that you're doing. Is how do you explain this to a climate policy person? How do you bring it to life in a policy? And I mean, we can think about it for 2 minutes and then come back. There's no problem. But I mean, because obviously, from what you're saying, we have a critique, right? We have a critique that both science and society are actually disrupted, and the commons are a way to actually bring it into the climate space. How? I mean, you did mention regulation and EIA as one way to do it.
I think one way to do it is really bring more and more empirical evidence. That's what I think we try to do in our work as well. One, to counter the dominant narrative and the dominant ways that are prevalent right now, which are posed both as solutions and governance, and to show that it doesn't really work. So can we have more and more evidence to show that this is really not working, even for the intended consequence or intended objective that you are stating? So even for the stated objective, just to go back to the example of, say, renewable energy, that it is really not taking you to the objective of, say, scaling up renewable to the extent, because it's counterproductive after a point. If you won't include people, your projects are stalled. That is happening in many cases. So those kind of, I think, evidence do help in bringing stakeholders together, even industry, because industry is also suffering. So developers are suffering because they're like, oh, we didn't know that, okay, this kind of land has this kind of value. We were never told. Fair enough. A lot of times industry doesn't think in those lines because it's abstract, as we discussed in the beginning, unless someone is telling them. So they were not told. They were like, oh, this is land readily available, wasteland. Why don't you just come and take this? And it's like, oh, wow, this is very good land for us. We'll just take it. Then they realize there's so many social, ecological complications when they start building on the ground. So it's not even fair for, say, the capitalists and the industry that, they are getting stuck with their investments, etc. So that governance needs to be sort of, there has to be discourse on, okay, what is the real value of the land? Can we really, talk with evidence? So I think that is very important. Data helps in that sense. And even say, something as I was talking about, that the commons have the value for communities in terms of climate adaptation. Can those stories be made more tangible? And instead of having them as abstract concepts or more diffused concept, because unfortunately the current model of governance or technocratic model looks at tangible sort of results, dashboards, data, etc. So if you like, okay, so what are the tangible examples of how communities have benefited from commons in real tangible terms, which could even be like, either enhance livelihood, enhance social well-being of the communities, or enhance environmental benefits to communities. And it doesn't have to be, say, quantified in terms of number, but even in terms of their real stories, qualitative data of what's happening. And so we try to do something in our work. We're trying to document, say, in a project called 100 Stories, Success Stories of Commons. And we had to do a lot of thinking to define how do you make success of commons more tangible to people who are not part of this. How do they see as success? And something that Siddharth was talking about, commons as collective action, the success as collective action, commons as knowledge. So is there learning exchange within the communities around commons, and that's a success story? And what is that leading to? Is there collective action which is improving the governance of the resources in the area, conserving resources? So many stories are coming out from the ground to that impact. For example, in some parts of Punjab that we found that women are coming together to break the caste barrier as well as gender patriarchy, to take control of commons in the villages and cultivate them. And they have even innovated the governance model for that. So they are working with the panchayats to say this is a new governance model where women will come together and conserve these commons and agricultural land. There was one instance where many sort of villages came together to just protect one hand pump, because that is the only source of water which is not contaminated in that area. And again, women took lead there. And then the government sort of recognized the value and acknowledged the value, and then they sort of formalized that protection mechanism through governance models as well. So the value, those stories have become, I think, good case studies to show to the current sort of predominant structures that this needs to be sort of acknowledged and formalized. Models of governance of people around common needs to be formalized. That would lead to more tangible results in even climate sort of crisis.
You want to build on?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting, right? So I was kind of thinking about the recent disasters in Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand, and also the Wayanad disaster I spoke about, right? Now the state might have a disaster response team and all that. The state is absolutely paralyzed when it comes to a disaster. There again, it's local, traditional networks, communities, physical, intellectual labor, which becomes around the commons, but just common knowledge about the landscape, which becomes so crucial. You cannot govern in the climate era without actually engaging with local collectivities and solidarities. Very, very important.
If I have to just gather from the very deep insights that the two of you have really, if one applies the commons lens to climate change or climate policy, it very clearly says, gives a sense that climate change is not just about carbon emissions, it's about food, it's about culture, it's about a whole bunch of things that happen on the ground.
Yeah.
if you apply the commons lens to climate change, then you realize that climate change has to be understood not just in a technocratic way. It has to be understood as a means of collective action. And almost the third thing that what you just said, Siddharth, and then you were highlighting Sambhav, is that if you apply the commons lens to climate change, you need to have commons so that there is resilience.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, it's almost these three kind of themes have emerged from what you all have said.
Commons as space, commons as sentiment.
That
builds resilience.
Yeah. So I think it's very deep insights that lead to that kind of, it brings it out very clearly. Yeah.
And I think there's, just to add to a little bit more, both facts and context to it, in many, many communities, there is increasing acknowledgement of how do we work with the local resources in for climate crisis. So there's one in Maharashtra, in Zendipar, there's a village and the many villages around that where communities, Gram Sabhas, have come together to form an association of Gram Sabhas, and they're incorporating climate solutions in their CFR, community forest resource management plans.
Okay.
So formally recognized plans for community forest resource management in the Forest Rights Act, where they're saying these things that we are going to do additionally to make ourselves more resilient for climate. And it's like in as many words it's recognized. So they're like, okay, agroforestry, then there is organic pesticides and herbicides use of organic nature. Conservation, certain ways of conserving water bodies so that it becomes a buffer in terms of climate crisis. So they are using those models. Now, again, I think these models needs to be sort of amplified and talked about at the policy level, policy discourse level, which is at this time mostly focused around the capital. Something that we also realize in these policy negotiations is that when it comes to money flow for climate work and climate solution, even say from development agencies or global money flow to developing countries, there is a lot of resistance for public money for work. It's mostly what they call is innovative finance, which is largely capital, private capital and private finance. And when the private finance is flowed in the climate work and climate solutions, it is mostly capitalist, so through private players. Now, while we are saying, okay, renewables are good, and that's why they should be exempted from EIA or SIA, etc. It's the private capital for private profit. And the real sense of what should be the public good around it has to be more inclusive and more sort of public money. So there is lack of public money in climate work as well, which is also causing this sort of invisibility of real ground solutions around commons. So that acknowledging that, I think there has to be more effort to make a case for building the discourse around commons in the climate policy work, and also recognizing that there needs to be more money which has to look and acknowledge these solutions and not just the private solutions.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? Like, public works in the climate era, right? If you need to kind of federalize some kind of budgetary allocation, right? And I think community needs access to those public funds. Because like you said, it's all captured by private funds now.
I mean, both of you have given some great examples, but in my last question to you all, it could be the same place that you're talking about. If there's one place where you think there could be some answers to the questions that we are really talking about, you already spoke about a place. It could be the same place or some other place that either one of you could actually highlight, where you could say, okay, even if there are beginnings of this, there are elements of those answers to the dilemmas that we really spoke about, what would be that place somebody could just go to?
So I would say then, it's a kind of different way of putting it. Go to the places, to the disaster zones. Go to places around Shimla and Himachal Pradesh, which have been destroyed recently. Go to that place which was kind of buried under the Wayanad, the landslide. See what people are doing there now. How they're kind of building their lives around now, right? Despite the state.
Right.
Right. So, it's a kind of not a nice way of putting things, but that's where you learn.
Yeah. Yeah, even in the coastal areas, I think communities are the biggest conservators of mangroves because they are the first ones at the front line for, say, climate disasters, etc. So what should be the role of the state to really conserve mangroves, even provide legal protection, etc. That comes later before, and the communities have done amazing work in, say, coasts of Odisha, I know at least, and in Gujarat also, where they have suffered through typhoons. Conservation of mangroves has been amazing work that they have done, and then that's a clear example of, climate, building resilience towards climate. In the place I was talking about, Zendepar, they have, I did talk about many measures that they are taking. One of the, another thing that they have been doing is they actually collectively decide on grazing passes, so that the whole one argument which is made for state capture or private capture of commons is that the communities would sort of overgraze, etc. But they have their own system of issuing passes so that it doesn't get overgrazed, which works fantastically well. In another village that we sort of heard and someone documented from our team from Chhattisgarh, it's called Tiriya village, where just by protecting forests, they have enhanced their income through very sustainable use of bamboo from the forest and selling it in market, but also building ecotourism around bamboo in the places, and then that has strengthened the community as well as the governance and the protection of resources on the ground, which I think would be a good example to see if someone really wants to see.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for your engagement with the topic and really, really deep insights, dilemmas, possibilities, promises, tragedies, all of it together. It was a pleasure talking to the two of you, and lots to think about. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And more power to your work out there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.